So next we're going to consider the employment issues and what special things you need to think about in relation to the employees involved.
Morning, my name is Michael Leftley. I lead the employment group at AG. I just wanted to touch on some of the employment issues around this scenario. Assume for these purposes that we've now transported our potential fraudsters from Qatar to the UK, because I want to talk about UK employment law as opposed to Qatar employment law, which will be a very short talk. It's really important to get the employee side right, and I mean, as Ben was saying in his piece, one of the first things you're going to be considering is whether or not you want to suspend those who you think may have been involved in the fraud, but you need to be very conscious of their employment rights and how you deal with them, because if you get that wrong, you potentially find yourself in a situation where you've got fraudsters within the business who brought employment claims, and as GC you're having to say to your board, yes, well, we may need to pay compensation here for infringement of employment rights, notwithstanding XYZ's happened. So it's important not to sort of react in a knee-jerk way and just think through what you're doing and why you're doing it. And as I said, the first thing that you're going to think about is whether or not you're going to suspend, and who are you going to suspend. Is that just going to be the core fraudsters, or is there a sense that there may be people beyond that who potentially you need to suspend? Step one, have a look at the employment contract, see whether or not there's an express right to suspend. If there is, there's still more considerations. If there isn't, potentially you can still suspend, but if you wanted to suspend without pay, you would need an express right to do that. So are we going to suspend or not? Well, the types of things we're going to be thinking about there are, is the presence of the individuals within the workplace potentially going to jeopardise the investigation? With the scenario that's been painted for you this morning, that's very, very likely indeed. Is there a risk that evidence may be destroyed? Clearly. Is there potentially a risk to other employees? So those are the kind of thought processes that you need to go through before taking a decision to suspend. And it's important to remember as well that suspension isn't a neutral act. So if you decide to suspend, we then need to crack on with the investigation as quickly as we can, because we can only suspend for a reasonable period of time. And the risks around suspending when it's not reasonable to suspend, or suspending for too long a period of time, is potentially breaching trust and confidence, and then getting a reaction from the employee where they're perhaps alleging constructive dismissal, or indeed walking and bringing a constructive dismissal claim. One of the consequences of that being that you will lose the restrictive covenants in the employment contract if they're successful with that claim. So those are just some of the things to think about around suspension. And if we then move forward, we've gone through the investigation, we now think we've got evidence which demonstrates that there's likely to have been a fraud. We then need to decide what we want to do with those employees who've been involved. And that's something that you will want to deal with at that point in time. It may be that a decision has been taken to report to the criminal authorities, and there's a criminal investigation going alongside. But what you're not going to want to do is wait for that criminal investigation to be concluded before you deal with your own employees. So potentially thinking about disciplinary proceedings once you've concluded the investigation. From an employment law perspective, there's an employee has a right to be accompanied to a disciplinary hearing by a work colleague or trade union representative. They don't have a right to be accompanied by their lawyer, so that's something that you can push back on if they ask for that. Thinking about sanctions, for the core group who've been involved in the fraud, clearly the likely sanction there is going to be dismissal, but there may be others who've been involved in a peripheral way who you also need to deal with, not because they've been directly involved in the fraud, but perhaps they haven't followed internal processes, procedures, which has allowed the fraud to be perpetrated in the first place. So you may want to think about sanctions in connection with those employees as well, which may be some kind of formal warning or demotion, perhaps something short of dismissal. When applying disciplinary sanctions, it's important to deal with people, deal with each employee consistently. So for the the same issue, we should be applying the same sanctions subject to any mitigating factors relating to a particular individual. And then when it comes to termination, it's important to think about the standard of proof, and this is a burden of proof, and this is another reason why you wouldn't want to wait until a criminal investigation is concluded, because it's entirely possible that that criminal, if a prosecution is brought, that prosecution may not be successful because of the standard of proof, whereas from an employment law perspective, when looking at the contract and whether or not we dismiss on notice or without notice, we're just looking at the civil test, so the balance of probabilities. But when it comes to statutory employment rights, we're actually looking at a lesser test. There's just a three-stage process that you need to go to. The employer's got to have a genuine belief of the guilt of the employee. It must be reasonable to hold that belief, and you must have reached that conclusion having undertaken a reasonable investigation. But provided you've gone through that process, and provided you've also conducted an appropriate disciplinary process, then it will be fair to dismiss. Finally, the last point I just wanted to touch on, which isn't up there on the slide, but it's just around data protection issues and monitoring, because that's something which is going to be a key part of any investigation. So when you're looking at that, again, you want to be looking at your DP procedures as it relates to employees within the business. Have you notified employees that there will be monitoring going on? Have you conducted an impact assessment? So, I mean, short form, but just basically looking at the situation, conducting an impact assessment, just setting out why there's a need for monitoring, what kind of monitoring you're going to do, how are you going to be looking at emails and other data relating to employees, etc., etc. And provided you've gone through that, then you should stay the right line of the Data Protection Act. So that's all I was going to say on the employment issues.